Okay, so the first psychotherapy they mention is psychoanalysis and psychodynamic therapies. So, of course, psychoanalysis was created by someone who was not a psychologist, right? This was created by Sigmund Freud, of course, and he was a medical doctor, a neurologist for his time. So he was never a psychologist, right? But anyway, we we list his therapy under psychotherapy. Of course, I don't know if you remember, but I'm somewhat critical of Freud's point of view. And, well, I guess we covered it in the personality chapter too, how wacky his ideas could get, right? Um, so anyway, yeah, psychoanalysis was the treatment approach that he developed. Now, of course, things that are important that he believed were among the causes of disorders, of course, were the unconscious conflicts in the mind, right? The unconscious conflicts of the mind, and of course, the origins of all this stuff happen in our childhood experiences, right? So we had, all of us, I guess Freud thought, had these traumatic experiences in our childhood, and that created unconscious conflicts that would stir in our unconscious mind and create all sort of angst and psychic energy that would creep out in various kinds of mental disorders, right? So he, of course, thought you have to achieve an insight into the underlying causes, and I think in this chapter they do. You can separate kind of psychotherapies into insight therapies versus non-insight therapies. So there are some therapies that believe that you have to achieve some sort of insight into something before the patient can get better, right? Before the client can get better. We like to use that term in psychology, client, right? So obviously in psychoanalysis, you're trying to achieve some sort of insight into the unconscious cause of the excess anxiety or depression or whatever it may be that the individual is experiencing, right? So Freud is looking for things that will give you clues as to what's going on in the unconscious mind of the client. And so they mentioned a number of techniques that he used. Of course, we've mentioned before dream interpretation, right? Have clients share their dreams, do the dream interpretation stuff, right? Try to figure out the latent content of the dream, what it's really about, right? That's what you're looking for in the dream, and that what it's really about is something in the unconscious from the id, right? If you remember that. But there are other things. You can just do free association. Just have the client, this very stereotype for Freud. Have the client lay on the couch and just free associate. Just say whatever pops into their head, right? So free association would be another way to do that. And you're looking for clues, right, as to what's going on in the patient's unconscious mind. Other ways, clues as to what's going on in their unconscious mind might come out. They mention a number of things that are common and expected in psychoanalysis. This is what Freud believed. So I mentioned transference, right, the phenomenon of transference. So if the client, comes to express either love and adulation upon the therapist, or maybe even become attracted to the therapist, or the reverse, if the client comes to really resent and hate the therapist, this would be what Freud's, this could be a clue that the client is transferring. The client really has, these are their unconscious feelings for their parent, and they're transferring those feelings onto the therapist. So they talk about transference. This could be a clue. How they're reacting to the psychoanalyst could be a clue as to what's going on in their unconscious mind as well. So there's a number of things like that they mention in psychoanalysis. It is a face-to-face therapy, as they say. I mean, you got the client and the therapist right there, right, one-on-one. And so that's the kind of therapy we're talking about for now, is the one-on-one therapy. Later in the chapter, they talk about group therapies where there might be a group of people, right? But psychodynamic therapy And of course, we mentioned some of this wacky stuff that Freud believed, you know, back in the personality chapter, you know, Oedipus and Electra complex and that kind of stuff, right? So nowadays in psychodynamic therapy, they're more likely to call it. There are still some strictly psychoanalysts around, but they are expensive. And generally speaking, psychoanalysis is kind of like the most expensive therapy you could have, because there's a lot of talking for a very long period of time in traditional psychoanalysis. So it's mostly rich people that get that, right? And highly verbal people. You know, people who can afford paying out of pocket for, you know, one-on-one therapy sessions 3 times a week with their psychoanalyst for 5 years. Right? I mean, come on. Most of us are not going to get that. Plus, my own personal opinion, I don't like psychoanalysts. I don't think it works. I don't think it's true that the causes to all our problems are unconscious conflict. I just don't believe that. Not me. So anyway, but nowadays, you know, they have psychodynamic therapy that is modified, right? So yeah, most people that use so-called psychodynamic therapy kind of use it more in the short term. You know, they've created more short-term therapy, so you don't have to see the therapist for years, you know. And they don't accept all those wacky ideas that Freud had regarding, you know, Electra complex and Oedipus complex and all that stuff, right? Not very many people really believe that stuff anymore. There's some that do, but, you know, most people don't believe that Freudian stuff. That's kind of historical stuff that most people don't believe anymore. So they try to have a psychodynamic therapy, but it still tends to focus on talking about early childhood experiences. So it still values and thinks that there are a lot of things that happen early on in our lives that are relevant later. But they also try to develop this shorter term psychodynamic therapy too. I guess I'm kind of a skeptic about why they developed that, because, you know, like I said, traditional psychoanalysis is expensive because you see the person for years. No insurance is going to pay for that. Government's not going to pay for that. So you know, if you get any third-party payments like insurance or whatever for psychotherapy, it's usually short-term psychotherapy, right? They're not going to pay for years of therapy, generally speaking. But they'll pay, you know, they might pay for, you know, 12 weeks, 16 weeks, something like that. So I'm skeptical of the psychodynamic folks. This is my own personal bias here. You don't have to share this. But yeah, I kind of think they developed this shorter term therapy to kind of get some of that insurance money. But that's my own skeptical hat on there. And then that's my own bias because I've just, you know, that psychodynamic stuff doesn't attract me, right? And I personally don't believe it. There are other psychologists that do believe in that, though. But anyway, psychodynamic therapy can help people sometimes, and it can help people with depression. I think that's one of the things it's most often used for. Maybe people who ruminate a lot. Remember, we mentioned rumination for depression. It's just thinking, going over those bad experiences over and over, and they're thinking about the bad things that happened to them in childhood over and over. If that's really a problem for the person, this might really help. So I'll leave that there. And that's kind of the psychodynamic therapy. So I'll stop this video there.